Who is the bad guy in history who isn't actually a bad guy? The Roman Emperor Domitian was seen for most of history as an evil kind of guy, like a Nero or a Caligula. But the only contemporary sources we had were written by people biased in favor of the Senate. The thing about Domitian, though, is that he was the first emperor to truly throw off the Senate's illusion of power over the emperors. His father had kinda started the trend, but still gave them lip service and let them play the game, but Domitian openly undermined them at every chance. Through analysis, it's been determined just in the past few decades that Domitian actually must have been a pretty good emperor, who got successfully slandered by an objectively corrupt Senate. But if you look at the things he did there's no way he would have been regarded by the people as a bad emperor, or anything less than a capable administrator. I mean, the guy ruled for like 15 years, at a time when offing a bad emperor was standard practice. This is all from memory, so I hope my fellow Roman history nerds will correct me or fill in the gaps. Zangief. Just because you are a bad guy doesn't mean you are a bad guy. Benedict Arnold was repeatedly screwed over by his peers in the Continental Army. Once you hear his story, it's hard not to blame him for switching to the British side. Italo Balbo was an important person in the Italian fascist government. He was also very suspicious towards any alignment with Germany and hated anti-Semitism, because he grew up in Ferrara, a city with a strong Jewish community, and had Jewish friends. He wanted Italy to stay the hell out of the war. So, a fascist, but a somewhat tolerable one. If his views prevailed, a lot more people would be alive today. The English King Richard III got a lot of bad representative by his enemies since they managed to defeat and kill him. That and Shakespeare did the rest. But contemporary sources claim that he in fact wasn't a misshapen psychopath but a very regular and even kind person. Elizabeth Bathory will always be remembered as an insane serial murderess, even though later research shows that she may well have been the subject of slander in order to lay claim to her wealth. Caligula wasn't crazy. He was getting revenge and they got him before it started. And if you want to know what revenge, the Roman Senate was directly involved in his mother's and older siblings' murders, and Tiberius, Sejanus, and Calpurnius Piso were directly involved in his father's murder. This is the same Piso family that ultimately brought Nero down. Neville Chamberlain. After the meat grinder that was WW1, Europe was horrified at the idea of doing it again. Obviously appeasement didn't work, but he was trying to save his people from a repeat of the bloodiest conflict in history. He was just really fucking wrong. Jay Cutler. He treated being an NFL QB as a regular job and did only what was necessary. Didn't go above and beyond. He was crucified for it, but he really had it right. History is pretty loose here, but many people think Pontius Pilate was the bad guy. He was simply doing his job as governor, and as the story goes, took a vote from the present crowd on whether to crucify Jesus or Barabbas. The crowd voted to not crucify Barabbas, and Pilate thus ordered the execution of Jesus. Oh boy, time to sort by controversial. Dr. Kevorkian. He was giving patients who were suffering a painless way to end their life and was written off in history as a murderer. Machiavelli. People misunderstand that the prince and believe it to be a manual for despotism and absolute rule. What Machiavelli argued, rather, was that desperate times called for desperate measures, and sometimes it is necessary to do immoral actions because of the circumstances. Hear me out. Walt Disney. https://www.cartoonbrew.com/disney/y-walt-disney-is-a-ju-37185.html. With regard to Disney's alleged anti-Semitism, Colt said that claim was not based on any truth, so he saw no reason to bring it up in the film. Colt said she looked for evidence of Disney's bigotry, but to no avail. Deadline Hollywood quoted her as saying, "Unlike the subject of her previous PBS film, Henry Ford, who was a virulent anti-Semite, in the case of Disney," she said, "it wasn't relevant to who he was, so it's not part of the film," DH reported. https://www.jpost.com/israel-news/culture/no-truth-and-claim-that-walt-disney-was-and-anti-Semite-410-965. I don't think I've ever seen anyone in history with even close to as much misinformation about them out there. He was honestly just a pretty regular guy for his time period, and probably more progressive than 90% of his peers. Marie Antoinette was actually very concerned about poverty and peasants' rights, at a time when it was incredibly unpopular for a queen to have such opinions. She never said, "Let them eat cake," and she didn't spend tax money on jewelry. The charges that ultimately got her guillotined are also known to be sham charges, and the evidence was fabricated. Aaron Burr. People hate him because he killed Alexander Hamilton in a duel. Hamilton was a horrible man who essentially wanted a royal class ruling America. The play Hamilton is very historically inaccurate. The nuclear spies allowed other nations to deter the United States from nuclear warfare as a real military option. The US government seriously considered nuking Korea in 1950 and China in 1958. They may very well have done so if the threat of nuclear retaliation against them didn't exist. Nobody said it, so I'm saying it. Napoleon. I suppose it greatly depends on the point of view someone takes, but I'm sure some people would say Oppenheimer was a bad guy. Sure, I get that mutual nuclear destruction that's possible these days isn't a fun thought, but I wouldn't say Oppenheimer was necessarily to blame for this possibility. King George III. Well, yes, he was crazy and a difficult king. But he ended slavery for England almost 60 years before the Americans. Elvis to black community, they attribute a quote to him that he never said, and was in fact one of the biggest supporters of black culture when it was taboo, and always said he wasn't the king or the original, always giving credit to black artists, but he's portrayed as this caricature good old boy racist who stole and took all the credit when it's simply not true.